What if I told you that a company founded in 1872 introduced concepts like money-back guarantees and direct sales from manufacturers? Montgomery Ward revolutionized shopping long before Amazon existed. Let's explore how this retail giant rose, fell, and changed America along the way. My name is Matthew, and this is Those Wonder Years. Imagine a world where you couldn't just click to buy something. How did people shop before the internet? Let's turn back the clock to 1872. That's when Aaron Montgomery Ward had a brilliant idea, a mail-order business to serve rural folks who couldn't easily get to stores. Ward started with just a single sheet of paper listing 163 items. Can you believe it? This tiny catalog was the start of something big. It aimed to help farmers get affordable goods without dealing with greedy middlemen. Ward's company introduced some pretty revolutionary ideas for the time, like money-back guarantees and selling directly from manufacturers. These innovations did more than just make shopping easier. They slashed prices for everyday Americans. It was the beginning of a whole new way to shop, and boy, did it change things. Catalog kings, the golden age of mail order. Remember that tiny one-page catalog we talked about? Well, it didn't stay tiny for long. By 1896, something incredible happened to that single sheet of paper. Can you guess how big the catalog grew? It ballooned to a whopping 672 pages. That's right. Montgomery Ward's catalog had become a hefty tome packed with everything from clothing and furniture to farm equipment. Imagine the excitement when that massive book landed on your doorstep. It was like having an entire department store delivered right to your home. For rural Americans, this catalog was more than just a shopping list. It was a window to the wider world. Farmers and their families could now browse through pages of products they'd never seen before, dreaming of owning items that were once out of reach. The Montgomery Ward catalog quickly earned a special place in American homes. Folks started calling it the Wish Book, and for good reason. It held the dreams and desires of millions. Families would gather around, flipping through its pages, circling items they hoped to buy someday. It wasn't just about shopping, it was about hope, imagination, and the promise of a better life. But Montgomery Ward wasn't alone in this catalog game for long. In 1896, a new player entered the field, Sears. And boy, did things heat up. These two retail giants went head-to-head, competing for America's attention and dollars. It was like the Wild West of retail, with both companies trying to outdo each other with better products, lower prices, and fancier catalogs. By 1900, something happened that shook up the retail world. Sears outsold Montgomery Ward for the first time. It was a wake-up call for Montgomery Ward, showing just how fierce this rivalry had become. But don't count Ward out just yet. They still had plenty of fight left in them. Let's take a moment to imagine what it was like back then. Picture a farmhouse in rural America. The kids are playing outside and Ma's busy in the kitchen. Then Pa comes in with the mail, and there it is, the new Montgomery Ward catalog. Everyone gathers around, eager to see what's inside. The kids are dreaming of new toys. Ma's eyeing that fancy sewing machine, and Pa's considering a new plow for the fields. One customer remembers, the arrival of the thick, glossy mail-order catalog meant Christmas was just around the corner. Nothing quite compares to leisurely perusing the catalog's pages, discovering new products, and imagining them in your life. It wasn't just a catalog, it was an event, a tradition, a part of the fabric of American life. And boy, did that fabric stretch far and wide. By the 1950s and 60s, Montgomery Ward was distributing over 20 million copies of its catalog. That's a lot of wishes being made. It just goes to show how deeply ingrained the company had become in American culture. From big cities to small towns, everyone knew the Montgomery Ward name. But it wasn't just about the numbers. The catalog represented something more. It was a symbol of progress, of America's growing prosperity. It brought the latest fashions, technologies, and conveniences to every corner of the country. Whether you lived in New York City or on a farm in Nebraska, you had access to the same goods. It was a great equalizer, in a way. Remember, this was long before the internet. There was no Amazon, no online shopping. The Montgomery Ward catalog was the internet of its day, a vast marketplace at your fingertips, delivered right to your door. It changed the way Americans shopped, thought about products, and even how they saw themselves. Shifting gears, the automobile age. The roaring 20s brought more than just flappers and jazz. A shiny new invention was about to drive Montgomery Ward into uncharted territory. What was it about this innovation that would force the retail pioneer to shift gears? It was the automobile, believe it or not. That's right. The same invention that gave us road trips and drive-in movies was also responsible for shaking up the retail world. You see, before cars became common, most folks relied on catalogs like Montgomery Ward's to do their shopping. But once people could easily drive to stores, everything changed. Imagine you're living in the 1920s. You've just gotten your first car, and suddenly the world seems a whole lot bigger. Instead of waiting for the catalog to arrive and then waiting even longer for your order, you could hop in your Model T and head to the nearest store. It was a whole new way of shopping, and it was catching on fast. Now, you'd think Montgomery Ward would have been all over this, right? They were the kings of retail innovation, after all. But here's the thing. They were slow to catch on. While their competitor Sears was opening stores left and right, Montgomery Ward was still focused on their catalog business. It wasn't until 1926 that Montgomery Ward finally opened their first retail store. That's right, 1926. By then, Sears had already been in the brick-and-mortar game for over 40 years. Talk about playing catch-up. Once they realized they needed to change, Montgomery Ward tried to make up for lost time. They opened 244 stores right after that first one, and by 1929, they had over 531 stores. It was like they were trying to cram decades of expansion into just a few years. But here's the thing about rushing. Sometimes you make mistakes. While Sears had taken their time to figure out the best locations and strategies for their stores, Montgomery Ward was just throwing up shops wherever they could. It was quantity over quality, and it would come back to bite them later. Remember how we talked about the catalog being a wish book for rural Americans? Well, now those same folks could drive to town and see the products in person. They could touch the fabric of that new dress or sit in that rocking chair before buying it. It was a whole new shopping experience, and people loved it. But Montgomery Ward was struggling to keep up. They were so used to their mail order business that they had a hard time adapting to this new world of retail stores. It was like they were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And it wasn't just about opening stores. The whole way people shopped was changing. Before, you might spend hours poring over the catalog, making your wish list. Now, you could browse the aisles, pick up items, and make impulse purchases. It was a different rhythm, a different way of thinking about shopping, and Montgomery Ward was having trouble getting into the groove. To make matters worse, in the early 1930s, Sears offered to merge with Montgomery Ward. Can you imagine? The two biggest names in retail joining forces? But Montgomery Ward said no. They thought they could go it alone. Looking back, that decision might have been the beginning of the end. As the years went on, the gap between Montgomery Ward and Sears just kept growing. While Sears was becoming a household name with their stores in every town, Montgomery Ward was still trying to figure out how to make this new retail world work for them. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Montgomery Ward had been at the forefront of retail innovation with their catalog. They had changed the way America shopped. But when it came time for another big change, they just couldn't keep up. Weathering the storm, depression, and war. Montgomery Ward's inability to adapt was about to be put to an even greater test. As the 1930s rolled in, the company faced not just changing consumer habits, but a full-blown economic catastrophe. What happened next would involve government seizures, defiant executives, and a dramatic showdown that would make headlines across the nation. How did Montgomery Ward weather this perfect storm? The Great Depression hit America hard, and Montgomery Ward wasn't spared. Imagine losing over $8 million in just 1 year. That's exactly what happened to the company in 1930. It was a staggering amount of money, especially back then. The company's customers, mostly rural and working-class folks, were struggling to make ends meet. Suddenly, those wish book catalogs weren't filled with wishes anymore. They were just reminders of things people couldn't afford. But just when things looked bleakest, help came from an unexpected place. In 1931, J.P. Morgan, the big Wall Street bank, stepped in. They hired a man named Sewell Avery to be the new president of Montgomery Ward. Now, Avery wasn't your typical retail guy. He was tough, no nonsense, and had some pretty strong opinions about how to run a business. Avery took one look at Montgomery Ward and decided it was time for some serious belt-tightening. He started closing stores left and right, nearly 150 of them. Can you imagine? It must have been a shock to see all those store-closing signs popping up across the country. But Avery didn't stop there. He also found ways to get inventory at lower prices, squeezing every penny he could to keep the company afloat. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. By the end of the 1930s, Montgomery Ward was back in the black. They'd survived the worst economic crisis in American history. But little did they know, another crisis was just around the corner. World War II changed everything. Suddenly, the whole country was focused on the war effort. Companies like Montgomery Ward were expected to do their part. But Avery? Well, he had other ideas. In 1944, there was a nationwide strike. The government, led by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, wanted companies to comply with labor agreements to keep production going for the war. Most companies fell in line, but not Montgomery Ward. Avery refused to budge. Now, imagine this scene. It's April 1944. The country is at war. And suddenly, U.S. Army troops march into Montgomery Ward's Chicago headquarters. They're there on orders from the president himself to seize the company's properties. It was like something out of a movie. But the real drama came when they tried to remove Avery from his office. Picture this: a bunch of soldiers trying to escort a defiant businessman out of his own building. Avery wasn't going quietly. In fact, he had to be carried out of his office chair by 2 soldiers. Talk about making a scene! Why would the government go to such extremes? Well, they said Montgomery Ward was essential to the war effort. The company supplied goods that were necessary for both the military and everyday Americans. In the government's eyes, Avery's stubbornness was putting that at risk. The government kept control of Montgomery Ward until late 1945, after the war ended. But even after they gave the company back, things weren't the same. The whole ordeal had stirred up a lot of bad feelings. There were problems with labor relations, and people were questioning the decisions being made at the top. While all this was happening, the retail world kept changing. Remember how Montgomery Ward was slow to adapt to the rise of automobiles and retail stores? Well, now they were falling behind again. After the war, companies like Sears were growing fast, opening new stores in the booming suburbs. But Montgomery Ward, they were still stuck in the past, struggling to keep up. Post-war decline, missing the boom. Remember how Montgomery Ward was always a step behind? Well, after the war, they didn't just fall behind. They practically vanished from the race. In an era of unprecedented growth, Montgomery Ward's decline is a head-scratcher. What happened to this American retail icon when everyone else was thriving? The post-war years were a time of incredible prosperity in America. Soldiers were coming home, starting families, and moving to the suburbs. The economy was booming, and people had money to spend. It should have been the perfect time for a retail giant like Montgomery Ward to thrive. But while other companies were riding high on the wave of post-war prosperity, Montgomery Ward was struggling to stay afloat. So what went wrong? Well, a big part of the problem was the company's leadership. Remember Sewell Avery, the tough-as-nails businessman who got Montgomery Ward through the Great Depression? He was still at the helm, and he was convinced that another economic downturn was just around the corner. While other retailers were expanding and modernizing, Avery was hoarding cash, preparing for a depression that never came. This conservative approach might have seemed prudent, but it was actually a recipe for disaster. While Sears was opening shiny new stores in booming suburban shopping centers, Montgomery Ward was stuck with outdated stores in less desirable locations. It's like they were still selling horse-drawn buggies while everyone else had moved on to cars. One customer from the time recalled, "I remember going to Montgomery Ward with my mom in the 50s. The store looked like it hadn't been updated since before the war." Meanwhile, the new Sears across town was all bright and modern. It was no contest where we wanted to shop. But it wasn't just about the stores themselves. The whole retail landscape was changing, and Montgomery Ward was slow to adapt. New discount retailers like Kmart were popping up, offering low prices and no-frills shopping experiences. These stores were a hit with budget-conscious consumers, but Montgomery Ward stuck to its old ways, unable or unwilling to compete on price. As the 1950s rolled into the 1960s, Montgomery Ward's market share kept shrinking. They were losing ground not just to Sears, but to a whole new generation of retailers. It was like watching a once mighty heavyweight champion getting knocked around by younger, faster opponents. By the late 1960s, the company's financial troubles were becoming impossible to ignore. Profits were down, and the stock price was falling. Montgomery Ward was struggling to keep up with the changing times, and investors were starting to lose faith. In 1968, the company tried to turn things around by bringing in a new CEO, but it was too little, too late. The damage had been done. Years of underinvestment and failure to adapt had left Montgomery Ward in a precarious position. It's a classic case of adapt or die in the business world. Montgomery Ward had once been a pioneer, revolutionizing the way Americans shopped. But now, they were the ones being left behind. The company that had once brought the latest fashions and technologies to rural America was now seen as old-fashioned and out of touch. The story of Montgomery Ward's post-war decline is a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency in business. Just because you're on top today doesn't mean you'll stay there tomorrow. The retail world was changing rapidly, but Montgomery Ward was stuck in the past, still operating like it was 1930 instead of 1960. the final chapter: bankruptcy and legacy. As the 20th century drew to a close, Montgomery Ward was on life support. Yet buried in its past was a creation that would become an American icon. How did a struggling department store accidentally create a beloved Christmas tradition? The story of Montgomery Ward's final chapter is a tale of missed opportunities and unexpected legacies. In the late 20th century, the once mighty retailer found itself in a precarious position. Years of failing to adapt to changing consumer preferences had taken their toll, and the company was struggling to stay afloat. By the 1980s, Montgomery Ward was a shadow of its former self. The company that had once revolutionized American retail was now drowning in debt and struggling to compete with more modern retailers. In 1988, they underwent a leveraged buyout, hoping to turn things around. But instead of revitalizing the brand, this move only added to their financial burdens. The 1990s brought more trouble for Montgomery Ward. While other retailers were embracing new technologies and adapting to changing consumer habits, Montgomery Ward seemed stuck in the past. Their stores felt outdated, their merchandise uninspiring. It was like walking into a time capsule from the 1970s. In 1997, the inevitable happened. Montgomery Ward filed for bankruptcy. It was a shocking fall for a company that had once been a household name, but even this wasn't the end. The company limped along for a few more years, trying desperately to reinvent itself. But it was too little, too late. In 2000, Montgomery Ward filed for bankruptcy again. This time, there was no coming back. By 2001, all Montgomery Ward stores had closed their doors for good. The company that had been a part of American life for over 125 years was gone. It's easy to look at Montgomery Ward's downfall and see only failure, but hidden in the company's history was something that would far outlive its retail empire. Back in 1939, Montgomery Ward did something that would become a beloved part of American culture. That year, Montgomery Ward created Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Yes, that Rudolph. The lovable misfit reindeer who saves Christmas was originally created as a marketing gimmick for Montgomery Ward. The company wanted a character for a holiday coloring book they could give away to children, hoping to drive sales and engage customers. Robert L. May, an employee in the advertising department, came up with the story of Rudolph. It was an instant hit. Montgomery Ward gave away 2.4 million copies of the Rudolph booklet in its first year. Rudolph became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring the famous song and TV special that we all know and love today. It's ironic, isn't it? A company that failed to adapt to changing times created a character that has remained beloved for generations. Long after the last Montgomery Ward store closed its doors, children are still singing about Rudolph and his shiny red nose. But Rudolph isn't the only way Montgomery Ward's legacy lives on. Many of the innovations they introduced in their heyday are now standard practice in retail. The idea of a satisfaction guarantee, that was Montgomery Ward. Direct sales from manufacturers to consumers? Montgomery Ward helped pioneer that too. Even the concept of a mail-order catalog, which seems quaint in the age of online shopping, paved the way for how we shop today. In many ways, you could argue that Montgomery Ward's catalog was a precursor to modern e-commerce. Both allow customers to shop from the comfort of their homes, browsing a wide selection of products that can be delivered right to their door. Montgomery Ward's story is a reminder of how quickly things can change in the business world. A company that was once at the forefront of retail innovation eventually became a cautionary tale about the dangers of failing to adapt. But it's also a story about the unexpected ways a business can leave its mark on the world. Today, when we see a money-back guarantee or shop online, we're experiencing the echoes of Montgomery Ward's innovations. And every Christmas, when Rudolph's story is told once again, a little piece of Montgomery Ward lives on. Montgomery Ward's legacy in American retail is pretty impressive. They introduced some game-changing ideas that we still see today. Think about money-back guarantees and buying directly from manufacturers. That was all. Montgomery Ward. They even started offering credit cards way back in 1926, long before it was common. But it's not just about shopping. Montgomery Ward played a big role in rural America, bringing modern goods to folks who couldn't easily get to stores. And let's not forget